Who doesn't want to build applications super fast with a great structure and simple framework? We also need phenomenal security and user authentication built in to make sure we have a reliable system. One of the best frameworks for doing this is Django. Django is an open source framework for building web apps quickly and with very little code. In this course, we'll cover the essentials and we'll build a working application from start to finish. We go through signup, login, creation and deletion of content, the whole flow. And after teaching myself how to program, I've been working as a software engineer for many years. There are a few things you need to get the most out of this course. You will need a Python 3.8 virtual env, and you must install Django 3.2, but should also work with later versions of Django. This is a simple install. You'll just pip install Django and you'll get the latest version. We also need an editor. I'll use VS Code. And a browser. I'll use Chrome, but feel free to choose the tools you think are best for you. You might want to have at least some familiarity with HTTP and an idea of its methods. This will help you have a solid foundation and understand everything even better. With Django, we can have a whole project working in a matter of minutes. We can start our project by using a Django command called Django admin, and then a subcommand start project. Then the name of our project, Smart Notes, and then dot to indicate we want to create the project in this folder. Okay, so this command creates two things, a manage.py file and a folder called Smart Notes, the same name we gave our project. The manage.py file will be the entry point of your project. With it, you'll be able to run your project server, manually work with the database, and much more. If you look inside the Smart Notes folder, you'll notice that all the files here are related to the configuration of your project. The two main files you'll use here are the urls.py file, where you're going to configure, well, the URLs of your project, and the settings.py. Let's take a quick look into the settings.py. You can see here that there is a lot of global variables being defined. For instance, the debug equals true here tells Django that we are working in a development environment. Because we're in this safe development environment, it can return much more information when something goes wrong than it would in a production environment. You don't really have to understand everything it has right now. We'll get to it eventually. The only thing you need to know is that this is where you have the base of your project. As magic as this sounds, you already have everything you need to run your project. You can use Python, then the file manage.py, and the command run server to create a server using the default configurations we have right here. We can see here that there is some warnings in red, but you don't have to worry about it for now. You can also see that we're using Django version 3.2 and that the configuration file being used is the smartnotes.settings. This means that this server is using this settings.py inside the Smart Notes folder as the basis of it. You can also see that it gives a link to a web page hosted in the port 8000 of your localhost. This means that your project is up and running on your computer and you can access it by using your browser. Let's click here and see what happens. Yes, you can see here that it will open a web page with the default layout. This means that you have successfully created and ran your first Django project. Congratulations! When dealing with big software projects, we need to make sure we are not creating a mess. The way we do this is to compartmentalize our project into smaller sections that have clear boundaries from day one. That's why Django created the concept of apps. Let's create one to understand it better. We'll use again the Django admin command to create a new app called Home. You can see now that we have two folders, Smart Notes, which is our settings folder, and Home, which is the Django app we just created. Every time we create an app, we need to add it to the settings file so that it knows that that folder is part of the project we are running. Let's open the settings.py file and add the name of our app in the installed apps variable. In order to make things a bit more organized, I always leave a small comment separating this app, created by us, from those that were already installed by default. Okay, now that we have our project started, our app configured, it's time to create our first view. Let's go to the Home, then go to the Views file and write our first function. As you can see, this is a pre-configured file, so we need to create our functions here. Let's import from Django HTTP import HTTP response. We can delete this, and now we create def home. It receives a request, and it returns an HTTP response with a simple message, "Hello world." As you can see, this function is saying that every time it receives a request, it will return a response with the text "Hello world." Okay, but how does it know when to send requests to this function? Well, that's why we have the urls.py file. We can go back now to the Smart Notes urls.py and import this file there so we can have access to this function. So from Home, let's import Views. And now here inside the URLs patterns, we're going to add a new path. Let's call it Home. And let's say views.home. Okay, so let's run our server again and see what happens if we go to the localhost 8000. Yeah, so now instead of that beautiful page we had, because we have something implemented and not just the default configuration, we start to receive a 404, which makes sense because we never implemented anything here. However, because we have the debug equals true on the settings file, Django will list the endpoints that this project has available. And guess who is there? Yes, our home endpoint we just created. Now, if we go to localhost home, we can see that we have the hello world being displayed. Amazing, right? Let's take a moment here to understand what's happening. When a person goes to the home endpoint, they're making a request to that path. Django will go to the urls.py file to see if it's ready to receive a request at this path. Since it is, it will go to the views file, finally arriving to the function we defined. Since the function received the request, it can then respond with the message "Hello world." Django uses a common pattern as the way of structuring its project called Model View Template Framework, or MVT. Views are responsible for handling requests and responses. In this video, you have learned that views can be as simple as functions and can respond with something as simple as pure text. There are yet two additional layers for us to get familiarized with, right? These additional layers will allow us to increase our project's complexity while being simple tools to work with. The model layer handles the data and how it's stored, and we'll see more about it in Chapter 3. The template layer allows us to render the information coming from the database into lovely HTML pages. Okay, it's time to learn how to return HTML pages by using the amazing Django template language. Let's start by creating a folder called Templates inside our app folder. And inside this folder, we'll also create another folder with the same name as our app. So let's call it Home. This might seem weird, but it will allow us to quickly identify where a template is located, even if we don't know in which app we are on. This is a typical organization pattern for Django templates. Inside this folder, let's create a file called welcome.html. And inside it, we're going to add a basic HTML page. So an HTML tag, let's add a header with a title, so smart notes, and then a body with just one welcome to smart notes. Okay, so now we can go back to the views file and change our base function. Instead of using the HTTP response, we'll use the function render from the Django shortcut that's already imported here. To use this function, we need to pass three parameters: the original request, the name of the template, and empty brackets. I know there is a warning here in the terminal that sounds a bit scary, but don't worry, this is normal and we'll get to it later. Let's save this file and check the home endpoint again. And voila! Our beautiful HTML is now being rendered. You might be wondering why we left the empty brackets behind, right? Although we are writing an HTML page, Django is actually using a template framework to create the final HTML page that we see in the browser. We can use the brackets at the end of the function as a way of passing down information from the view to the template. So let's import the datetime module and pass today's date into the dictionary with a key called today. Datetime.today. We can then modify our template to receive a variable called today by defining it between double brackets. Today is today. Let's save it and try it again. There it is. This is why we're not using pure HTML, but actually a backend framework for defining templates called Django Template Language, or DTL. The HTML file we wrote will pass through the DTL mechanism, and it will insert the variables passed on the dictionary of the render function down to the template. This looks simple now, but DTL allows us to use sophisticated programming logic for creating dynamic HTML pages with very little effort. Earlier, we talked why apps are a good way to organize our project. Let's take a minute to understand a bit more why this type of modularization is such an important concept. As you've seen, an app is a small library that is contained inside your Django project. We can have as many apps as we want. However, as the project grows, if we don't take care of it, things can start to get messy and things will fly between the apps. That's why we need to understand what we need to do to make good Django apps. Good software projects should be well modularized, and your Django project should be no different. That's why each app should be self-contained, which means that everything you need for that app should live inside it. That's why we created the folder template inside it. The ideal app is one where you can delete the folder and do nothing else. The Django project just continues to work perfectly. So far, we're almost there, but there's still one thing that we need to do to clean things up. When we created our first endpoint, we had to import the views file from home into the URLs file in the Smart Notes folder. This creates a dependency that wouldn't allow us to quickly delete the home app. Let's make things a bit more organized. Okay, so first thing is to create another URLs file inside the home app. In here, we're going to create a file very similar to the one we have on the Smart Notes app. And let's add the same endpoint that we had in the previous file. views.home using the home function. Okay, so now comes the fun part. In the Smart Notes, let's get the URLs file. We can delete the dependencies that we implemented here. And now from the Django URLs, we're also going to import the include function. Now what we need to do is add an import path, but instead of using a function, we're going to use the include function here to pass that file as a string. So path, let's leave it open for now, and then let's include the home.urls file. Let's save this, and if we go back to the browser, yes, as you can see here, nothing changed except the fact that now if we delete the whole app, this won't give any errors because the app is not being imported on this Smart Notes URLs file. There, with just a couple of tweaks, we eliminated a dependency and your project is following good standards of Django applications. Even though Django is typically known for the ease in which we can create endpoints, one of the most powerful features is the Django admin interface. It provides an interface so that site administrators like you and me can easily view and manipulate data. Let's check out how that works. Are you wondering what you need to get it? Nothing. The system comes by default. When you open the localhost 8000, you can see that besides the home endpoint we created, the admin endpoint is also available. Let's open it. As you can see, this is a login interface. But what now? We didn't create any authentication system, right? Wrong. Django has the entire authentication system ready to go. The only thing we need to do is to make sure our database is properly configured. Let's go back. And remember when we had this red message while running the run server? This message is letting us know that our project has some database changes that weren't applied yet. The way Django knows if the database is behind the system changes is through a couple of files called migrations. Migrations explain what kind of changes a database needs to perform, such as create a new table, establish a new relationship, etc. Django already has the migrations for the authentication system ready, so what you need to do is apply them to the database, and we do this by using the command migrate that will actually change the database. So what we can do now is run the command migrate. Okay. You can see here that the changes made are all regarding the admin and the auth apps. We don't see these apps because they come from Django by default, but they are there and they're ready to be used. You shouldn't worry too much about migrations now. We'll learn a lot about them in future classes. Since now our database is up to speed with Django, what we need is to create a super user that will have all the powers it can in this Django project. We do this by running the command create super user. It's pretty straightforward. Let's make the username admin. I'm going to leave the email address empty, and I'm add admin as a password. As you can see, Django already has a couple of checks to guarantee we are creating secure passwords. You can bypass it for now, as I will, just because this is happening while we are developing this project locally. Never bypass it in production environments. Security must always be your #1 priority, and Django is here to help you. Okay, now we can go back to the localhost 8000 admin. Well, first, let's run the server again. Okay, now we can go back to the admin interface. Admin, admin, login, and there you go. Now you have full access to the Django admin interface. And as you can see, we don't have any red messages now while we run the run server because our database is completely up to speed with the project. There you go. The Django admin interface allows us to quickly and easily access data that exists in the database. This means that users and groups you can see here are actually tables in our database. If we open the users table, we can see that we already have one record, the admin user we created using the create superuser command. This is the one you're logged with right now. The interface also allows us to quickly filter the data by some of the characteristics of users. We can search for a user by staff status, superuser status, etc. You can also search by a characteristic on the search bar here. Let's create a new user, shall we? We have to go here on Add User, then add a username, and let's add a password, admin. Save. As you can see here, we can't bypass the password check on the interface. So we actually need a really good password here. And let's click Save. Perfect. Now we have the user created. As you can see, to create a user, we just need the username and password, but there is more to it, such as personal information, permissions, etc. All this complex authentication user was created by Django by default. We just need to use it. One thing that I would like you to notice is that the password is encrypted, and that's why you're seeing a bunch of random characters here. By using Django's authentication system, you're also guaranteeing that your system is correctly and safely storing passwords. If we go back to the list of users, you can see now that we have the user we created. We can also select it and delete the selected user. As you are deleting data, Django prompts a second screen with the data you're deleting so you can confirm that you want to perform this action. So let's click Yes, I'm sure. And there, we successfully deleted that user. If we go back to the home page, we can also see that the interface lists the actions we made in the system, such as the creation and deletion of a user. As you can see, the admin interface is a nice and safe space to directly access data in the database. If your system doesn't require inputs from users, like a blog for instance, you can use this interface to create all the data you want and use the views to display it. It's simple and powerful. So far, you've learned that Django comes with a powerful authentication system already ready to be used. Now, let's learn how to use it. First, let's go back to our home app and create a second template. Let's call it authorized. And in here, let's create a simple HTML that has a title, "You are in a restricted area." Now we can go back to the views file and create a very similar function to home, but this time we're going to display the authorized template. Def authorized request, then it's going to return render request. Now let's add the home authorized.html and empty square brackets. Yeah, so now we have exactly the same thing. And here comes the wonderful Django simplicity. In here, let's import from django.contrib.auth.decorators. Let's import login required. So now we can add this function as a decorator to our authorized function. That's it. That's all we need to do to block the access of this web page if a user is not logged in. To finalize, let's go to the urls.py and add this as a path. So let's call it authorized and views.authorized. Now we can go back and try to access the authorized endpoint. There you go. We can see the template we created. This is only possible because we're logged in via the Django admin interface. If we go back to the admin and log out and try to re-access the authorized area, you see here that we get a 404, meaning that this page was not found. Why is that? Because we're not logged in. The complex authentication system just required a single line of code. However, a 404 is really not a nice flow, right? We want the user to know that they need to be logged in to access this page. The ideal flow is that we redirect them to the login page. To do this, we need to go back to the views file and add a parameter called login URL, and let's pass this as /admin. If we go back and try to access it again, and there it is. Since we are not logged in, Django understands that it needs to redirect me to the login URL, which for now was defined as the admin endpoint. How amazingly simple was to add authentication to this endpoint. So far, you've gotten familiarized with the user models, which were completely defined by Django. Now, it's time to understand how to create your own models and how the structure of creating models work. Django uses an Object Relational Mapping System, or ORM, to handle database communication and changes. What you'll need is to write class models that will then be transformed by migrations into database tables. Each class, known as a model, is a database table, and each class attribute is a column. The way we transform a model into a database table is by the creation of migrations. Migrations will have the step-by-step transformation that a database must do to apply the changes made in the code. You've seen that we use the command migrate to apply migrations to a database. Similarly, we can use the command make migrations to create migrations based on the current code. The process of using a class, defining a model, creating a migration, and applying a migration and the changes to the database is the ORM's job. And Django's ORM is known for being one of the best ORMs for Python and SQL databases. It is time for us to learn how to create a new model using Django ORM. Let's create a new app specifically for our notes. So Django admin, start app, notes. Okay, remember now we have to go to the settings and make sure that our new app is added in the installed apps variable. Okay, now we can go back to this new app and open the models.py file. Here is the file where we can create the models that we'll use in this app. So let's create a new class called notes that will inherit from models.model. This way, Django knows that this is a model that will have effect on the database, etc. It's time for us to think what attributes we want in our node. Well, first we can add a title. A title is a short text, so we can use the type char field, which is a limited text field. Char field has a parameter called max length, and we should set it to a value, let's say 200. This means that our title can be over 200 characters. Okay, we also need the notes itself, right? And the note shouldn't have a limit, so instead of using char field, we can use the type text field. As you can see, text field doesn't require a max length, differently from char field. We also want to know when this note was created, so we can add a field called created that is going to be a datetime field. Because we don't really want to worry about this field being correctly populated, we can add a parameter called auto now add equals to true. This means that every time a node is created, this field will be correctly populated with the time that this node was created, so we don't really have to worry about it. There, our nodes model is done. Every node you create will have at least a title, a text, and a date. Amazing! So what do we need to do now? I hope you guessed it right. We need to create migrations. Luckily, this is super easy to do. Let's type python manage.py make migrations. Let's see what happened here. There is a new folder called migrations, and inside of it there's a new file called 001 initial. Every first migration of an app will be named like this. If you open this, you can see that this is just a list of operations that instructs the database what needs to be done. So far, we haven't changed anything in the database. We just created the set of instructions. So everything continues as it is. What we need to do now is apply the migrations. So we can run python manage.py migrate, and we're done. The changes were applied to the database and we have a shiny new table. We've already created a table for notes, but if you're curious enough to go to the Django admin interface, you'll notice that nothing really changed. Why is that? The same way we didn't have to create the user model, it was just there, we didn't have to configure it to appear on the Django interface. When we are creating a new model, we need to do it ourselves. So let's go back to the Notes app and open a file called admin.py. This is where we're going to add which models can be displayed and thus modified via the Django admin interface. First, let's create a class and call it NotesAdmin. This class should inherit from admin.modelAdmin. Let's add pass here because we don't want any additional configuration on this admin model. Now what we need to do is import from this folder. Let's import models. And on the bottom of the file, we're going to register that that model is attached to this admin model. So let's write admin.site.register, then models.notes, and notes admin. Okay, that's it. Let's go back to the admin and refresh it. There you go. Now we can see that the notes model is available on the admin interface. Let's use the add button here to create a new node. Let's title my first node, and then Django is so amazing. Let's save this. Okay, we have our first node created. One thing that isn't really nice is that it is listed as this nodes object 1. This is fine for now, but if we have a long list of nodes, how can we tell which one is which? Let's go back to the admin class. Instead of pass here, we can pass list display, which is going to be a tuple, and let's pass title here. Let's save this. It restarted, and now if we refresh here, there. Instead of having this ugly name, we have the title of the node being displayed here. The default configuration of admin also allows that all fields can be changed by all users. However, we can edit the admin model class and start adding some specialized logic. We can remove some fields from being edited. We can allow only staff users to write notes. There's a lot we can do. The sky's the limit. Django admin is highly configurable. We've already learned how to do things via the Django admin, but it's time to learn how to handle models through code. Django has a tool we can use to check the content of a database, which will make our life so much easier, the Django shell. Let's go to the terminal and type python manage.py shell. You can see here that we have a Python interpreter. However, this is no ordinary interpreter. It is already tightly coupled with our project. For instance, we can type from notes.models import notes, which is the model we just created. And with this, we can use it to query the objects in the database. Let's try to get the first node. My node, nodes.objects.get, pk is equal to 1. There, we have our node. Nodes.objects is the main way of accessing data from the nodes table in the database. The .get method will search for one object which the PK, private key, is equal to 1 and returns that object. Now we can use it to access attributes of the model by simply typing mynode.title or mynode.text. We can also query for all objects in the database by using the method .all instead of the .get. Nodes.objects.all. There you go. We only have one node so far. The return of this function is a query set, which is a very useful tool, but you can think of it as a list with superpowers. We can also create a new node via the command line. Let's try it out. New node, nodes.objects.create, then title is equal to a second node, and then text is equal to this is a second node. There, the node was added to the database. If we query it again, you can see now that we have two objects being returned. If you prefer, you can open the admin interface and check it out. We can also filter nodes that we want. For instance, we can query for nodes that have titles starting with the word my. Nodes.objects.filter, where the title starts with the word my. Yeah, the filter also returns a query set, which in this case returns the first object. We can also search by something that exists inside the nodes. For instance, we can try to find text that contains the word Django. So we type the nodes.objects.filter text underline I contains the word Django. There you go. Only the first object has the word Django in the text. We can also query for the opposite. We can actually filter nodes by excluding them. So let's do the opposite. Nodes.objects.exclude notes that the text contains the words Django. You can see now that the filter is returning the second node instead of the first. The fun part is that query sets can also be filtered, meaning that we can add multiple filters at once. For instance, we can filter all the nodes containing the word Django, but the title doesn't say anything about Django. Where text contains the word Django, but exclude the ones where the title contains the word Django. There you go. As you can probably imagine, we can go on and on here with thousands of examples on how to query data. Django's ORM has a very neat interface that is very intuitive and yet highly powerful. I highly encourage you to try more queries by yourself. Now that we have our nodes, how about we learn how to display them? Let's create a new view the same way we created the other one. So nodes views.py file, and let's start with importing the models and import nodes. Okay, now let's create a function called list that receives a request, and then a variable all nodes that stores all the nodes that we have in our database. Now let's return the render function again, request, a template that we're going to create a little bit later, nodes underline list.html, and now the brackets with nodes are equal to all nodes. This is not much different from what we did in the other view, except for one thing. We are querying for all nodes and sending them to the template. This way, when the template is rendered, all the information coming directly from the database will be available. Before we jump to the template, let's organize the URLs. So let's create a new URLs file here. And that's going to have the same format. So from Django.urls import path. Then let's import the views here. And then the URL patterns that has a list. Then here the path. Our endpoint's going to call notes because that's the list of notes. Then views.list, which is the function we just created. Amazing. The last thing is that we have to add this on the urls.py file on Smart Notes. So let's add a comma here, then path. Let's add smart here, and then include notes.urls. Amazing. By doing this, all the URLs that we are adding on notes URLs will be added after the smart. So smart is going to be a part of that endpoint. This is a really nice way of organizing our project. Okay, almost there. Now we need to create the template folder. So notes, new folder, templates, then a new folder, notes, and now we can add our template. Notes list.html. Okay, now we can create our template. So let's start by HTML and H1. These are the notes. And now we'll start to use the powers of DTL. Bear with me just a little bit. So let's start with UL and then curly brackets, 2 percentages, and in the middle for note in notes. Okay, so in here we're gonna add a line item, 2 curly brackets, node.title, close the curly brackets, and now we need to do curly brackets, percentage, percentage, and in the middle it's gonna have an N4. Okay, what's happening here? Everything that is between curly brackets is the Django template language logic. Here, we're opening a list tag, UL, and then saying that for each node we receive in the template, DTL should create a list item, the LI. Notice that commands such as the loop happen between curly brackets and percentages, while things that should be rendered by the template are between double brackets. So let's save this, then run this run server and open it. Okay. Okay, now we can see that we have a smart here. Then let's try the smart. We're gonna have the notes, and here are the notes. There it is, a web page that is dynamically getting data from the database and adding it to the HTML. If we right-click here and inspect the page, we'll see here that we actually have 2 line items. That's because we have only 2 nodes on the database. If we had many more would be created. How easy was that? I encourage you now to go and create more nodes, either via the shell or the admin, and see what happens here. Now that we have a list of nodes, how about we create a way to visualize details of a particular node? Let's go back to the Notes app, views.py, and let's create a new function here. Now this function should receive a second parameter called pk for private key. So let's go def detail request pk. Okay. Now we can use this pk to go in the database and get that particular node. So node is equal to nodes.objects.get pk is equal to pk. Okay, and the common response, return render the request. Let's keep the pattern here. So notes/notes underline detail.html. And then let's pass note inside the brackets. Okay, now what we need to do is create the template. So let's go back here, new file, notes underline detail.html. And let's create a simple HTML that has the title as node.title is an h1, and then let's go a text here, node.text, and there you go. Okay, so there's one thing still missing, which is the URL. This needs to be a slightly different URL because we need to be able to pass down the second parameter to that function. So let's do this by adding a new path here. So we're going to have notes, then slash, the minor and greater sign, int pk, great, and now the views.detail. Okay, so what we're telling here is that this URL will receive a new value named pk that will be an integer number. Now the only thing left to do is start the run server again and test this out. So here we have the notes, and if we pass now the pk for our first node, we can see the template displaying the details of the first node. Okay, so this works fine, but we still have a problem. The get method that we're using to get the node from the database will actually throw an error if you pass down a private key that doesn't exist. So if we try the same URL but with, I don't know, 11 or something, unless you have created 11 nodes, this will raise an error. So let's try it out. Notice here that this is returning an exception of the type does not exist. We can also see here that there is a message with the exception saying nodes matching query does not exist. Django has an amazing traceback for us to understand where exactly the error happened. You can see right here that the problem is started in line 11 on the nodes views.py file, which is exactly where we defined the query. We only have this paging explaining the error, again, because we continue to have the debug equals true in the settings file. In a production environment, the user would see a 500 error, which means an internal error. When an object is not found, the correct response is a 404 status code, saying that that object does not exist. So let's change our code to make sure that we get the correct status code. Let's go back to the views file. And in here, let's import from Django.http. Let's import http 404. Okay, and now we can wrap this query in a try and accept block. So try and accept if the nodes dot does not exist equals true, we're gonna raise an HTTP 404 with the message node doesn't exist. Okay, so if you go back now to the previous link and refresh, we're gonna see here that this page is now returning a 404 with the message that we define. This is a much nicer flow than the error we had before because we're controlling the message to the user. If you can, we can actually create another template specifically for a 404 and return it with a nice message. It is completely up to you. So far, you've learned how to create views using functions. However, Django has a couple more features that we can leverage to get things even simpler. Welcome to class-based views. Most views have similar patterns, and reinventing the wheel is something nobody really wants. Class-based views are extensive classes that implement typical view behavior, and you just need to override a few things to make it do what you want. This will allow us to avoid the boring work and focus on the things that are unique to our project. Let's go back to our code and change our views that are function-based to the ones that are class-based and see in detail how class-based views work. The first view we made was in the Home app. So let's go back and change it. The only thing we need to do here is display a template. So we can do that by using the class-based view template view class. So let's in here import from Django.views.generic import template view. Okay, so now we can create a new class called Home View that inherits from template view. And the only thing we need to pass here is the template name. So we can copy here and paste it here. And that's it. We still need one more thing because our template requires some extra information. So we can add a variable called extra context. And now pass this dictionary here in it. We can delete this now. Oops, it's missing something. Okay. So now we can delete this function here, and we have our first class-based views. The last thing missing is that we need to change the way the URLs are defined. So let's go to the URLs, and in here, instead of passing the home function, we're going to pass the home view class, and we need to call a method called asView. You can see here now that the server is working just fine. So we can go back here, and it's still working. So we can quickly do the same with the second function here, the authorized view. So let's create a class called authorized view that also inherits from template view. Then the template name, we're going to have this here. Oops, there's an extra space here. Okay. Okay, because we don't have the extra attributes required here, we can just not pass the extra content. Okay, but we're still missing authentication. How do we handle authentication on class-based views? Well, to do that, we're going to need a mixin class. Mixins are helper classes that can be used along with other classes to provide additional features. For this case, we'll use the login required mixin. So let's go back here and we can remove this now and use the from django.contrib.auth.mixins. We can import login required mixin. The only thing we need to do here now is make sure that this class, which is a mixin, is added before the template view. Okay? The last thing missing is the login URL. So we can actually go here, add the login URL. Let's still pass the admin, and that's it. So we can remove this now, fix the URLs to be authorized, view as view, and that's it. As you can see here, things are quite nice and well organized. And you also don't have to remember the requests coming in and out of the function. Class-based views might not seem like the amazing features they are, but that's because we are still handling simple views. As the views increase in complexity, they become more and more amazing allies. We worked with templates, but now it's time for more complex views. Let's start with our list endpoint. On the nodes, let's go to views.py file, and in here, let's import from Django.views.generic import list view. Okay, now we can start our class-based view. Let's go to create a class. So let's call it notes list view that inherits from list view. And we need to add here which model we're listing objects from. So let's add here model equals to notes. Okay. And because our template is expecting to receive a list called notes, we should also add here that the context object name is different from the default. The default is objects, but we call it notes. That's it. That's our whole endpoint. The only thing we need to do now is change the endpoint URL. So let's go back here, then change list to notes list view dot as view, and that's it. We can go back here and also delete our old endpoint. We don't need it anymore. Okay, it restarted. So let's try it out. Instead of homes, we're going to go to smart notes. There you go. You may be thinking, what's happening here? Where is the query? The list view is already making the query for us. We also don't need to define a template name because we created a template name that follows the standard of that class-based view. But if we add a different name, it might not work. So instead, we can pass here an attribute called template name. You guessed it correctly. So we can say here notes underline list.html. Yeah, that's all we have to do for the list endpoint. Now we can go to the detail view. Can you guess what we need? Not much else. Just import here detail view, and then let's create the class. So class notes detail view that inherits from detail view. Here we need model equal to notes, and context object name is equal to note, and that's it. Wait, just that? You might be thinking like, what about the exception we throw when the object can't be found? There's no need. The detail class-based view already take care of that for us. There is no need for us to handle any of that complexity. Let's change the URL and give it a try. So in here, let's change detail for notes detail view dot as view. Let's go back, then .1, and it works. And if we go to something that doesn't exist, yep, it's still returning a 404. Hopefully, at this point, you can already see how class-based views are an amazing feature of Django. And we've only scratched the surface. There are very few case scenarios where you will prefer to create a function-based view as the ones you just replaced. In the vast majority of cases, a class-based view will be the ideal tool for you. It is time to think about our project's front end. Our templates are too simple with just HTML on them. So let's add some colors. The first thing we need to do is create a folder where we're going to store all the static files, such as the CSS and JavaScript files, images, videos, etc. So let's go here and create new folder, static. Now we need to tell Django that this is the folder it needs to look into when searching for static files. To do that, let's go to the Smart Notes, then Settings. Then in here, we can scroll down a little bit, and we're going to see here that there's a static URL already. Now we're also going to add static files underline dirs. This should be a list. And in here, we're going to say base dir slash static, which will lead Django to the folder we just created. Okay, now we can go back to the static and create a new folder just for the CSS files and one CSS file. Let's call it style.css. Okay, so in here we can create a simple CSS file. Let's create a class called node.le, color equals red. Really simple. What we need to do now is make sure that our template and Django per se recognizes this file. So let's go to the notes and let's try the notes list file. Okay, in here, the first thing we need to do is actually tell Django that this HTML is gonna use the static files. So let's go curly brackets, percentages, and load static. Okay, now what we need here is to add a CSS file as we would in any HTML file. So let's create a head, then a link. So the rel is gonna be style sheet. The type is gonna be text CSS. And on the href, we're gonna use the Django template language to add our URL. So let's call static, then CSS style.css. That's it. That's all we need to do to have the CSS being rendered on this file. So let's go here on the LE and add a class, which is going to be our class name, node.le, and let's save it. Okay, let's try it out. I'm going to refresh this, and there you go. Now the nodes are red because the CSS is being rendered and used in this file. If we open the inspector here, we can see here that the head is appearing. We have the href here being correctly rendered, and then each node here has the class that has the attribute of color red. If you hover this href, you'll notice that this is actually a link. So let's go here. Let's copy this, and then we can replace it here. And there you go. As you can see here, this is the file we just created. So actually, Django is locating the file and loading it automatically into the templates. There you go. Now you can use CSS in all your templates. As we've seen, it's pretty easy to add CSS files into Django template. But it would be quite exhaustive to need to always remember to add the CSS link to all templates we have in all our apps. If you're thinking that there must be a better way of doing this, you're absolutely right. What we need now is a base template. Let's create a templates folder in the static folder and a base.html template in it. Okay, so in here we can create a normal HTML file. So HTML, then head, then in here we can have link, type's gonna be text CSS, then href, it's gonna be the same loading of a static file that we had, CSS style.css. Okay, now we have to remember to load static on the top of the file, load static, and now we can create a body. Perfect. Now what we need to do here is add the following command. So curly brackets and percentage, block content, and then similarly we're going to do another one, but now is and block. Okay, so I called this content, but you can call it whatever you like. The important thing here is to know that this is a block area where we can inject things. Let's try it out. Let's go back to the notes and open the notes list template. So in here, what we can do is extends base.html. Now what we can do is get rid of all this basic HTML stuff here and use this block content here. So block content, and in here we can end block. Okay, So what we're doing here, we're taking only the important part of our template and wrapping it on the block content command so this can be injected on the base template. Let's try it out. Okay, so we have a problem here. The template is showing as non-existent. What happens here? So you can see here where Django was trying to search for a base.html template. So you can see that it tried in multiple places, including the two templates folder in Home and Notes app. But as you can see, the static folder templates is not being looked for. So what we need to do is tell Django where to look for. So let's go back. Then in here, let's go to Settings File. And down below, we're going to find out that there is a templates. And there is a list of directories that we can add here. So similar to what we did on the static files, we're going to add that particular folder in here. So let's do base dir and then slash and then static templates. Okay, so it reloaded. Let's try it again. And there you go. So let's take a minute to understand what's going on here. What's happening here is that with this syntax, we can define the basics of our HTML in our base.html template, and then we create each web page as a separate template that extends the base. So we will build each template separately and just the small parts, but we will then inject it to the base template where we can have all our default configurations such as the CSS files and the JavaScripts. This will allow us to keep each web page template as simple as we can while keeping all the configuration in a single place. That's another power of the Django template language. Now that you know exactly how to use a base template, I encourage you to go back and try it out in all the templates we have so far. Okay, so instead of defining all of the CSS, we want to speed up our front end a little bit, so let's use a CSS framework. We're going to use Bootstrap for now, so what we need to do is on the static base.html, I'm going to change this CSS we just created with the link to the Bootstrap framework version 5. So we can go back, delete this line, and that's it. I know it's a pretty big link, so you can find it on the notes of this class. Okay, once we've defined this, we can start using it. So the first thing we can do here is on top of the block content, let's add a div. And then on this div, let's add a class equals to my5, text center, and container. Okay, so now we can go to the home page and check the changes that the Bootstrap's already made. So let's go here. You can see here now that the style is a little bit better. We have more spacing, the text is on center, etc. So let's add a button on the home page that will lead us to the list of notes. So let's go to home, welcome, perfect. Here we can add, so it's going to be an href. Let's leave it empty for now. Then in here we're going to use two classes, btn for button and btn primary for the style. Then check out this smart notes. Okay, so if we go back, we can see now that we have a button, but it doesn't do anything. So how do we deal with links here? We could hard code the link to our local host, but imagine that when we deploy our website, we need to remember to come back and change everything. Not so good. Thankfully, the Django template language has a function for that. What we need to do is the following. Let's open curly brackets and percentage, and then use URL. And then in here, we're going to say notes.list. Okay, you might be wondering, okay, how Django knows which endpoint to link. It doesn't, and we need to tell it. So let's go back to notes, URLs, and in here, what we're going to do is add a name. So we can give a name, notes.list. That's all we need for Django dynamically define each endpoint we are pointing to, no matter if you're on localhost or production. Let's test it out. Let's click here, and there you go. We're being redirected to this template. That also needs some styling. We'll get there. So let's go back to this page and try to style it up a little bit. So let's go to notes list, and in here we need a couple of things. So first we can add some vertical styling here. So we're gonna use my 5 here. Okay. And let's use a couple of divs here to have some cards. So bear with me just a little longer. So in here, instead of the UL, we're gonna use a div, and this div is gonna have classes equal row, row calls 3 and G2. Then we're gonna have another div here, and this div is gonna have a class equals to call. Okay, and finally we're gonna have another div that is gonna have a class equals p-3 border. Okay, so this here is going to be a row, and we're going to have each card to be a column. So what we can do here now is say that for note in notes, we're going to have in here, let's add a title. So it's going to have here note.title, and then let's end the for here. So, and let's leave it for now like this. So we can remove this. Okay, let's check out. Amazing! This would look a little bit better if we could display some of the text of a note, but not all of it. We can use the truncate chars function to do this. Let's try it out. So in here, let's add note.text, and then with the pipe, truncate chars. Let's just leave it at 10. So this is going to display 10 characters. So let's try it out. And there you go. So what's happening here is that Django is taking the text and just displaying the first 10 characters plus the 3 dots. It looks a little bit better, doesn't it? Okay, so it's still missing a couple of things. So we can't really access all the details of that particular note. So we're almost there. First, let's give a name to the detail URLs as well. So let's go back, urls.py, and then in here, let's add name is equal to notes.detail. Okay, so now we can go back, and in the title, we can add the link. So it's going to be an A with href is equal to the URL and then notes.detail. Let's pass this to here. It's still missing something. So we also need to pass here the PK. So the PK is going to be the node.id. Pretty simple. We can also add some classes here just to make it a little bit prettier. So let's pass class is equals to text dark and text decoration none. Okay, reorganizing. That's it. Let's try it out. Let's go back, refresh, and you can see here that now we have a link to the specific node. But now we're still missing some details style here. So let's go back, notes detail, and let's just add here a div. This should be in here. And on this div, let's add a class border. Let's make it round. And just add some style on the h1, so my equals 5. Okay, I think we're done here. Let's go back. Yeah, so all done. Now you have style and dynamically generated links. How amazing was that? Whenever we're building a system, there's a couple of common operations that we should support for every model we create. These are the create, read, update, and delete, or CRUD operations. These are the minimal operations that a system should typically support. So far, regarding the nodes model, we implemented the retrieve method by having an endpoint to get the details of a particular node. To fully support the nodes model, we need to handle all the other 3 operations as well. Now, we're going to learn how to implement a create method. Let's go back to nodes views.py. And in here, let's import, well, I hope you guessed it, create view. Once we have this, we can actually start our new class. So class nodes create view that inherits from create view. And we're going to need 3 things here. So model equals to nodes, fields, which is going to be title and text, and finally a success URL that is going to be the /smart/nodes, which is our list endpoint. Let's understand what's going on here. First, the model. So the endpoint understands what is regarding to. Then the fields will be the attributes from the model that we allow a user to fill. Since we don't need to pass a created add field, we just define it as title and text. Finally, we want to redirect the user to the list of existing nodes so they can see the node they just created. This is the success URL attribute here. And that's it. That's all we need to do in this class. Now we can add the endpoint to the urls.py file the same way we did to every other endpoint so far. So in here, let's add path, then nodes/new, and then we can call view nodes create view dot as view. And let's not forget to pass a name to it. So nodes.new and a comma here. Okay, so the last thing that's missing is the template. So let's create it. Let's call it nodesform.html. Okay, so let's use the default template. So extends base.html and then the block content and finally the end block. Okay, so now we can start. To send the information back to the server, we'll need a form tag from the HTML. So let's add this here. Okay, so in the form, we can do action is equal to, we're going to use the method URL and then nodes.new, which is the endpoint we just created. And also the method here needs to be post because we're sending information back to the server. Okay, so now all we need is to allow a user to pass back the information we define on our endpoint, title and text. How do we do that? Well, this can't be more simple. In here, we can do double curly brackets, then form, and that's it. Want to see what happens here? Let's go back to the browser and try out our new endpoint. So in here, we can open the inspector element, and you can see here that in the body, we have a form. And the form is actually passed down to the HTML as 2 label tags and 1 input tag and 1 text area. This is because Django already knows which type of data each attribute expects. Thus, it creates an appropriate HTML tag to receive it. Well, we're still missing the submit button, so let's add that. So in here, let's add button of type submit. The class is going to be btn btm primary. Let's add some vertical alignment. Submit. That's it. Now we have everything we need in place. That is basically all we have to do to have an endpoint to create a new node. We did everything we needed to do to implement the create endpoint. But if you try to create a new node, you'll notice that it will actually return a 403 error, meaning that we are forbidden to do this action. Well, we're actually missing one last thing to our form. So if we go here, we can add curly brackets, percentage, and then a CSRF underline token. And that's it. So let's try again. We can go back, refresh this page. So this is a new node. It worked. Let's submit. And yes, indeed, it works. You're probably wondering, what is this magic that was missing? This is a CSRF token that stands for cross-site request forgery. What happens here is that every time a browser requests a web page that has a form, Django will send a unique token to that browser. This token will be securely kept and no other website can access it. When the user sends back a form, it will also send back the token, allowing Django to know that this request is coming from a legit user. Django will then process the request and return the appropriate response. However, if for some reason a third party have access to the user credentials, when they try to make the request from another browser, they won't have the token, so Django understands that this request is coming from an unreliable source and will not process the request, thus preventing this type of attack. As you can see, this is an additional layer of security that Django is adding to your website with just a small line of code. Beyond the numerous features that allow you to speed up the process of creating a website, these security features are a big part of why developers choose Django to work with. Adding a new endpoint was nice and easy, but now it's time to consider more complex scenarios. Model forms are the best way of doing this on Django. Let's check it out. First, we're going to create a file called forms and inside our Notes app. Okay, so in here, let's add from Django import forms and from models import notes. With this, we can create a new class called NotesForm that's going to inherit from forms.modelForm. And inside this class, we're going to create a new class, Meta. Okay, that's going to receive model, which is notes, and fields, just like we added on the class-based view for create view. So title and text. Okay, with this, we can come back to the views.py file. And in here, instead of passing the fields, we're gonna pass a form class. That's gonna be our notes form. We also need to import it. So from forms import notes form. Okay, so far what we did will result in exactly the same behavior as we have so far, but the form will give us power to do much more. For instance, let's say that we want to add a specific behavior that just allows us to add notes that contains the word Django in the title. Let's go back to the forms. What we need to do here is add a new method called def clean, and the field we want to add a validation, in this case, title. So in here we can get the title from the clean data, which is a dictionary. The clean data is returned by the form, And it's particularly useful for fields with strong validation, like for instance, emails. In this scenario, it will be exactly the same value as the user passed. With this, we can actually start our validation. So if Django not in title, we're going to raise a validation error with a message. We only accept notes about Django. If everything goes well, we just return the title. Okay, so we have here the validation error already imported, and we can try this out. Let's go back to our browser. Let's add a new note, which is a test. Let's submit this, and we have our error. We only accept notes about Django. Okay, so this is pretty cool. Django already injects the validation errors directly to our HTML. You can see here we have a UL that has a class error list and a list of errors. This is pretty cool, but we can't really control the design. So let's change this a little bit so we have a really good validation error here. We can go back, and on our style CSS, we can add here that the UL error list is not going to be displayed. So we're going to control this. Then on the form template, we're going to add an if block. So if our form have errors, we're going to do something. So let's close the if so we don't forget this. So and if, then in here we're going to add a div, which is a class of type alert, and let's make it an alert danger, some vertical spacing, and in here what we can do is pass the form errors title and as text. Okay, let's go back. Let's refresh this. And if I add a new note, which is a test, try to submit this, and there you go. Now you can add validations in any field you want with just a couple of additional methods in a form class. This form we just created, it's starting to look nice, but there's work to do here. It's still missing some style. One alternative would be to build the whole form by hand with each label and each input, everything. As you can see, this is not such a fun activity once you have a form already laid out for you, right? Forms are amazing because not only they add validation, but also because you can quickly add styles to it. First, let's say that we want to change the labels of our form. Title and text are the words we use on the backend, but that doesn't mean that it looks so good for our users. What we can do is on the class meta, add a field called labels, and in here let's add text. It's gonna be write your thoughts here. Let's save this. Now if we go back and refresh this, as you can see, we are controlling the UX directly from our backend. We can also add an attribute widget to inject CSS classes directly to the form. Let's go back and add a new field called widgets. And then in here, let's add title. And this is going to be a forms text input. And then we're going to pass attributes. This is going to be a dictionary, and the class is going to be form control and some vertical spacing as usual. We can do a similar thing with the text. So text, this on the other hand is not a text input but a text area. And also we're going to add again attributes, and let's add the same classes. So class is equal to form control and this. Let's go back and check it out. Refresh. Yeah, you can see now that controlling the front end in an easy and accessible way is also a main advantage of using model forms. All this without ever changing the original template. Nice and easy. Okay, so now we have the create endpoint. It's time to create the update endpoint. Let's go back to the views file on notes. And on here, we're going to also add update view. Now we can add a new class, notes update view, that inherits from update view. And we actually just need to copy this from the create view and paste it here. That's it. That's all we need to do. The only thing still missing are the URLs. So what we can do is go back here. We can copy and paste the details view and then add here a /edit on the endpoint. Change the class, where is this originating to, and the name. That's it. That's all we need to do. If we go back to the notes now, get the first node, and then add a /edit at the end, you can see that we have our form here, and we have the fields already filled in with the data from that particular node. So if we try something, just save and try again. Uh-oh, it didn't work. Okay, so let's check it out what is going on. If you go to our template, if you notice here, we're actually hard coding which URL the form should be sent to. We don't actually need this. The form is smart enough to know where to send this to. So let's get rid of this. Let's go back, edit, and then submit it. If we see now, our node was edited. That's it. So editing basically comes for free after you implemented the create endpoint. We can style this page a little bit. So let's go to the template. We can add a cancel button that will return from this page if the user changed their mind. So we can go to href is going to be the function that have URL, and then this go back to notes.list. We still need some class here, so let's tie button and then button secondary, and then cancel. We can also go back to the details. In here, we can create a new button that will take us to the edit page. So the href, then curly brackets, percentage URL, notes.update, and then pk is equal to node.id. Let's add some class here as well. So btn and btn secondary, edit. Okay, let's try this out. If we go back here and this node, we now have the button edit. We can actually edit here, and then we can actually cancel or submit. There you go. Now you have a full cycle between list, detail, and edit with just a couple lines of code. So it's time to think about the last operation from the CRUD operations, deleting data. Let's start as usual. Let's go back to the views, and from here, we're going to add actually from Django views generic edit. Let's import delete view. The delete endpoint is even simpler than all the endpoints we created until now. We can add a new class, nodes delete view, that inherits from delete view, and we actually just need the model and a success URL. Once more, the endpoint URL needs to be added to the URLs file. So let's go back here. Let's copy this, and instead of edit, let's call this delete. Let's change the class here and the name. Now, we need to create a template to confirm if the user wants to delete a particular note. Let's go here and add a new one called notes_delete.html. So let's start with the basics. So extends base.html, then block this is also going to be a form. So let's add form, and the method is going to be post. Since this is a form, we can't forget about the CSRF_token. And then in here, we're going to add a message. Are you sure you want to delete? And then let's add notes.title. Let's add quotes here. And then another message saying that this action actually can't be undone. And finally, an input button, type is equal submit. And the class is going to be btn danger. So it can be a nice red. And value, it's going to be confirm. Since we already have our template, we can go back to the details and add yet one more button here called that will lead us to the delete. Let's make it red as well. Okay, it's time to try it out. Let's go back to one particular node. Now we have the delete button, and if we click here, okay, we're getting again a template does not exist. We can see here that while it was loading the template, it was looking for a template with the name notes confirm delete. So we have two alternatives here. One is to change the name of our template to match the template that Django is expecting. I prefer to usually add the template name to avoid having to remember which template is related to which endpoint. So we can come back here to the views and add a template name. This name is also very similar to the other template names that we have. So in my opinion, this is a little bit better, but you can choose whatever you prefer. Let's try again. Let's delete this. Okay, we have our message. Let's confirm. And there you go. The note was deleted. Right now, no matter if a user is logged into an account, they can create notes on the system. However, we want the system to be aware of who's logged in and only display the notes written by their original author. How can we do that? So far, we have two tables in our database, the notes table and the user table. We need to save in the notes which user was the author, and we can do that by creating a link between the user table and the notes table. This is what we called a foreign key. Let's go back to our model and import the user model that comes with Django by default. So from django.contrib.auth.models import user. Now we go to the notes model and we add a foreign key. Now we go here and we add models.foreignKey. This here needs a couple of things. The first item is the model we want to create a link with. In this case, this is the user model we just imported. Then the second item is going to be the onDelete. This means that we want to define what happens to this node if the user associated with it is deleted. In this case, we're going to use models.cascade, which means that if a user gets deleted, we also want to delete all the nodes associated with them. Finally, we can say how we will identify this relationship on the user side. Related name. It's going to be nodes. Okay, now that we changed the model, we need to create a migration. Let's go and type Python manage.py make migrations. And we're getting an error. The problem here is that we defined that every node needs to be associated with a user, but our database is already fully populated by nodes without users. So we need to define what to do now. Since we have a user, admin, and its ID is 1, we can pass this as the default user on this migration. If we pass any ID of a user that doesn't exist, this migration will fail. So we should pass an ID of a user that exists. Let's add 1. We're going to provide a one-off default, and the ID is going to be 1. Okay, so now we can actually apply the changes to the database with Python manage.py migrate. As I said, this is only working because we do have a user with ID equals 1 in our database, but it would break otherwise. When creating migrations and adding default values, you should always take care to avoid creating migrations that can break if you start the project again from scratch. Let's test our implementation and see if it works by opening the shell. So Python manage.py shell. And let's import the user. From django.contrib.auth.models import user. And let's get the first user. So user is going to be user objects get pk is equal to 1. So this is the admin user that we've been using so far. What we can do now is actually see the nodes that this user has. So we can count them. And we can see that all the 5 nodes that we have in our system is associated to that user. We can even get all the nodes from here. So if we say user.nodes.all, we're going to have all the object nodes being displayed here. That's it. Now we can start making changes to make the system user aware. Every node now has the user that created it, but our endpoint is still displaying all the nodes from all the users. We also didn't add any authentication, so in order to keep privacy, we need to fix that. So let's go back here on the nodes views.py and import from django.contrib.auth.mixins. Let's import login required mixing. Then on the list view, we need to add the login require mixing. And don't forget, required mixing. And let's not forget to add the login URL. So for now, this is going to be the admin. This login URL means that if a user tried to access the list view and it's not logged in, they will be redirected to the /admin instead of seeing a 404. Okay, so now what we need is to change the query so we can only display the queries of the logged in user. But where is the query? As we discussed earlier, class-based views are highly powerful and yet highly changeable. We can use a documentation website to check for all the methods that we have available and find out which ones we need to change to get the behavior we want. This is the website that I look for when I want to change a class-based view. It calls CCBV because it's called Classy Class-Based Views. You can see here that we can change the Django version we're using. It is not updated to the version 3.2, but I think we'll be just fine with the 3.1. So let's go to the generic list and go to list view. In here, you can see all the classes, the methods, the attributes, everything we can configure in this list view class-based view. So after some investigation, I realize there is a getQuerySet method here. Whenever a user goes to the list endpoint, the first method that it will call will be the get method because we're making an HTTP GET request. Let's check it out. Whoa, okay, so there's a lot going on here. However, we can quickly see that there is a method here that gets the object list by calling a method called getQuerySet. Okay, so let's check that method. GetQuerySet, here it is. There's still a lot of things going on here, but we can see that this is the method where the query to the database is made. Jackpot! This is the method that we need to alter in order to list only a user nodes. If we go back to the code now, we can actually override the getQuerySet method, and instead of returning whatever it is returning by default, we're going to return self.request.user.nodes.all. That's it. A couple of changes, and now our endpoint is requiring user authentication and then using the user of that request to just display the nodes that were created by that user. We change our nodes to have a user, but let's try to add a new one and see what happens. So this is a new node. Does it work? Let's submit. Uh-oh, okay, we have an error. You can see here that there is a constraint that a node can have a null user. The problem is that we don't say in the form to consider the logged in user as the author of that node. So we need to change this, and this is a bit tricky, so bear with me for a second. So in here, on the create view, we're going to override the method def form valid that receives a self and form. The first thing it is that we need to get the object, which is going to be form.save, and then commit is equal to false. Now we're going to fill the object. So self.object.user is going to receive the request user, and then we're going to self.object.save, and finally we need to return an HTTP response redirect, and then this is going to get self.get success URL. Let's see. The HTTP response redirect is already being imported from Django HTTP response. And that's it. That's what we need to get our form validating. Okay, so that was a little bit tricky. Let's understand what's going on here. So the data is sent by the user, passed inside the form, which asks a simple question. Is this data valid? To see if the data is valid, the form would call a couple of methods that have the title started with clean, so clean title, clean text, like the one we changed before. If something is wrong, the method is valid returns false, and the class-based view will raise an exception. On the other hand, if all checks clear, the data is stored in a variable called clean data, and when you call form.save, that will save the object directly in the database. And that's it. It all happened very smoothly. So what happens here is that when we pass title and text to the form, the method isValid returns true. Then the formValid method will call the save and will try to save to the database. But although the form is returning isValid is equal true, the database is forbidding us to try to save a node without a user. That's where we get our error. What we did here was to get in the middle of it, so we can inject the logged user as part of the object. We do this by passing the attribute commit equals false that creates the object but doesn't save it to the database. Then we have the object, We insert the user, and then we call save, successfully saving the note with that user to the database. As you can see, class-based views can be changed as you please. Now the endpoint is working and life is good again. So we refresh here and add a new note. Yeah, as you can see, class-based views can be changed as you please. Now the endpoint is working and life is good again. We are almost there. The last thing remaining for our app is to create a proper login place. Although the admin login is nice, it can only be accessed by staff members of the system. So we need to create the authentication interface as well. Let's do this. So first let's go to Home, then Views, and then let's import here from django.contrib.auth.views, import login view. And then let's create a class called login interface view that inherits from login view. And in here, we only need to define really one thing, the template name. So let's go call it home/login.html. Okay, so we can't forget about the URLs. So let's do this now. So in here, let's add a login page that inherits from views, login interface view as view. Okay, so now we can create a template. So in here, let's add the new login.html. And in here, really, all we need to do is extends base.html to get all our configuration, and then block content, and finally end block. Okay, so in here, what we need is simply a form. This form should have method equals to post. Because this is a form with method post, we can't forget what our dear friend CSRF underline token. And then we're going to use form as P because it's going to be rendered as P tags in the HTML. That's the only difference. And finally, we're going to have an input. The type's going to be submit. Let's add some class here. So BTN and BTN secondary. And that's it. Okay, let's try this out. So we're going to go here, go to login. Okay, let's try to log in. Okay, so what happened here? The problem is that Django has a default system defined configuration for the redirect, which leads to a page we don't have, which is this account profile page. Because this is a global definition, we should change this not in the class-based views, but we should change it on the settings. So let's do this. Let's go back. Then let's go to Smart Notes, Settings, and then we can add this way below here. And we can add login redirect URL. It's gonna be smart/notes. So this is where we're gonna redirect the user after it is logged in. So let's try this again. I just remember we are completely logged in here. So first, let's log out to make sure our login works. So login, then let's add our credentials, and it works. Amazing. Okay, so similarly, we also want a logout view, right? We don't want to have to go to the admin to do this. So let's add this real quick. So on the views again, from here, we're going to also import logout view. And similarly, we're going to create a logout interface view that inherits from logout view. And the only thing we need is the template name. Yes. So let's add here home/logout.html. Okay, so let's create the template. Logout.html. For sake of time, we can copy this and paste it here. And instead of having a form, we're going to have an H1 that says, hope to see you soon. Okay. Oh, yes, and we're missing the URLs. So let's do this. We're copying logout and logout. And for the sake of organization, let's add names to this URLs, shall we? So this is going to be our home page. We can actually get rid of this. Our system doesn't really need this. Then we have login. And finally, logout. Okay. One more tidy up to do. Let's make this empty. Okay, let's see what that causes. If we go back, the empty here means that now this welcome page is going to be the default page without any path. And then if you go to logout and try to access the smart notes again, there you go. Because we're logged out, now we can't access the notes and it redirects to the Django login. We need to change that as well, but I'm going to leave this to you. Now that we have a login and logout endpoints, it is time to create a signup page. So first, let's go to the home, views.py, and then in here, let's import from here from django.views.generic.edit, import create view, and let's create here a class called signup view that inherits from create view. And so form class is going to be user creation form. So template name can be home register.html. And finally, the success URL, that's going to be the notes list. Okay. Oh, the creation form is actually a Django function. So Django contrib.auth.forms, we can import user creation form. Amazing. So that's all we really need to do to get a sign up page. Let's create the template. Let's go to home, the new file register.html. As usual, we need the extend base, etc. that I'm going to copy here. Let's delete this. And now what we need here is also a form that also needs the method post. As usual, we need the CSRF token. And then here we can also just use the form SB. We also need the input button that has the class btn. Btn is secondary, and type is equal to submit. And let's add a name here also, so submit. And that's it. Let's check it out. So if we go here and type signup, oops, we can't forget the URLs. So let's go to the URLs, and then that's a new path that's going to be called signup. Views is going to be signupview.asView. And let's not forget the name, signup. Okay, let's try again. Okay, so we still have some styles here to do. So let's add some style as well. Let's go back. And then in the form, we're going to add some centralization and text right. So let's align the text to the left. And then margin is going to be 0 auto. And then let's add a width of 600 pixels, more or less. Okay, there you go. Now we have a sign up all ready to go. Let's create a new person. So in this case, I'm gonna use my handle. Let's add some password here and submit. Wait, are you seeing here that the notes are from another user? Like, how can we have notes for someone that just logged in? What's going on? Well, the problem here is that we are allowing a logged in user, which was the admin user I was using here, to go to the sign up page and create a new user. What we can do is make sure that only people that are not logged in can access the sign up page. We can do this quite simply by overriding the get method and redirecting the user if they are already logged in. So let's go back. Let's go to the views file. And then in here, what we can do is first, let's import from Django.shortcuts. Let's import the redirect function. So what we're going to do here is define the method get that receives self request args and kw args. What we're going to do here is use the super method and the get that will call the original get with the same parameters. So args and kw args. Okay, so this is essentially doing the same thing that it was doing so far. The only difference now is that we can add an if here, and let's say if the self.request.user.is authenticated, what we're going to do here is return the redirect to the notes.list. Okay, let's try this out. So I'm with a logged in user. So if I go here and I try to sign up, it won't allow me because I'm logged in. So let's go to the admin, log out, and then let's try again. Yep, it's working. So now we can go to login, use our new username, and there you go, I'm logged in. So you can see here that I have no notes because this is a freshly signed up user. Okay, we are so close. It is time to add it all together. So let's go to static, templates, base HTML. And then in here, what we're going to do is add a nav, so a navigation bar. We need a couple of classes here, so let's add navbar dash dark, and a dark background. Okay, inside of it, we're going to need a div, and this div must have a class MSAuto, and then in here we can add a link. Okay, so let's add a link to the login page. So in here, let's add href that has the command URL login and then some classes here. Let's make this a button. So btn outline light. And let's add some spacing here. Okay, let's try this out. Amazing. So you can see here that now we have a login button, but it doesn't really make sense to have a login button for a logged in user. So you can see here that we have a logged in user. So let's add some logic to change this. So if it's an authenticated user, we want to display the logout URL, not the login. So in here, what we can do is use an if statement. So if user.is authenticated, yes, this is the same method as we used before. We're going to display something, and then if else, we're going to display something else, and then we need to end the if. Okay, so now if the user is authenticated, we don't want to show the login, we want to show the logout. Same thing here, logout. Okay, let's see how that goes. I'm going to refresh. Okay, now I have a logout. If I try this, I'm going to get my end message, and now I'm going to see the login because I'm not authenticated. So let's try that. Let's authenticate here. And there you go. So we have our login logout. We can use the same logic to add other things. So for instance, if a user is authenticated, we also want to have a home button so they can go to notes.list and a create button so they can go and create a new note. But if they are not authenticated, we also want to display the sign up option. Sign up and then sign up. Okay, so let's try this out. I'm authenticated. If I click home, I'll see the notes that I have. If I go to create, I'll go to the create page. And if I log out, I can see the message saying that I'm logged out. What I can do now as a logged out user is actually signing up. So let's try something different. I'm gonna add a username Django. Let's add some passwords here. Let's submit. Okay, so it redirects me to the login page. So I can try my new user. And there you go. Now if we create a new note here, we have our first project up and running with the full authentication cycle.